This is our second installment in our virtual speaker series of 2022. I'm Jim Garrison. I'm the program coordinator here at the Conde-Charlotte Museum, and we're proud to host Paula Webb.
Hi.
She's the author of Such a Woman, The Life of Madame Octavia LeVert. Paula Webb LeVert has a master's in library and information science from the University of Alabama. She's currently a tenured librarian at the University of South Alabama in Mobile. She's written two other books, Mobile Under Siege, Surviving the Union Blockade, and Mississippi Mojo, Mississippi Mojo, Murder...
And Murder.
And Murder, Tale of the Blues. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
Please remain muted for the duration of the lecture. If you have any questions, feel free to type them out in the chat. We'll get to them at the end of the program. And with that, I'll let Ms. Webb take the floor.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. This is such an honor and such a great crowd. Thank you so much. Whenever I tell the story of Octavia, you're going to really learn a story about an amazing person. And I've done various talks about her for the last 6 years now. The book actually was published and launched a year ago now. It started at the Richards DAR house. They were so excited to be the launch of Octavia, or Such a Woman, and we'll get into why it has such a title too. And so with that, the popularity of the book has grown. She's won an award now. The Mobile Historical Commission I gave an award for this book, and she continues to grow, which is awesome because sometimes women's stories are kind of forgotten, and people don't quite realize how significant a person is, especially in a town like Mobile and during the time period we'll discuss. But to go to the beginning, to really see also discovering stories and the research process. I first discovered Octavia whenever I wrote my first book, Mobile Under Siege. It came out in 2016, and I discovered those stories and put them together when I was a volunteer at the Minnie Mitchell Archives at Oakley. Has anybody visited Oakley? Okay, we've got some people that have visited Oakley. Please do. When you go to Oakley and you tour the site, there is a archives on site, and it's a collection of local history. And if anybody's, I don't know if everybody's a Mobile native or not, but if you are, then you know that Mobile is a very old city, and it's a very storied city. And you think that you've peeled the first layer, or you've discovered the first stories that happen here, and then you find more. And so I was volunteering at the Minnie Mitchell Archives, and the director there, Bob Peck, he said, there's all these old folders and these cabinets over here off to the side, and nobody's ever really looked at them. Why don't you take a peek? Well, I started looking through them and finding some of these old stories. And there was this folder, and this folder had accounts from the Civil War, Union and Confederate. And it had accounts more than that. It didn't have just the soldiers. It had women, children, some enslaved, not that much, but women and children predominantly. Stories that nobody had heard, or stories that had not been published since before 1900, or they were letters. Somebody who volunteered at Oakley at Minnie Mitchell at some point had written all of these commanders and soldiers and asked for them to send copies of their letters and their accounts. So these folders had these accounts. And so I started reading them and was just mystified by them. And I started putting them together in date order. And I started going, hey, you know, where is this material? Why isn't it out? Why is it kind of scurried away here in this little folder somewhere? So I then said, if there's this amount of material, then there's got to be more. And so I started reading and using my librarian skills, and I started going through archives and collections of other places in the area, seeing what there was about Mobile. Well, Mobile Under Siege formed from that. So it's those stories that people kind of forgot, or the stories and tales of people surviving in Mobile after the Battle of Mobile Bay and before the surrender. One of the people I discovered was Madame Octavia Walton LeVert. She was a Unionist living in this city during the time period. And she was actually a constitutional Unionist. It was whenever the party split just before the Civil War, there was Democrat, Union, and constitutional Unionists. And they were kind of where the Whigs went. So the Whig party died, and Octavia and her family had long been Whigs, and they chose constitutional Union. Kind of a middle, please everybody, don't separate from the rest of the country, but just kind of a please, let's please everybody. So she chose that route, her and Dr. LeVert, her husband. And he had died during the war. They were older, and he had a disease, and he had died. And she was alone at the end of the war. She never changed her sentiments. She never changed she supported her friends and family who were Confederate following and supporting. But she also had friends and family from the North and people that were close to her. And so whenever she welcomed the Union troops into her home, whenever Mobile fell to Canby and all of them, then she was ostracized and she had to leave the city. And I researched that story pretty heavily in the book, but that's not the story we're telling today. Maybe that's incentive for you to purchase the book or go onto Amazon and get it. Or if you've got Kindle Unlimited, it's free. Or you can get the Kindle version, it's $5. So these are incentives. That's a great story. I won't divulge, but that's not the one we're going to talk about today. Whenever I started diving to her life and discovering that she, whenever you read about somebody and how upset they were that she let the Union troops in her home, well, why did it matter for her? What was the big deal about a woman in 1865 letting Union troops in her house? I mean, why was it why did they just get so beside themselves over it? Seems a little much, right? A little overexpression of emotion and all that. So I kind of was like, well, there has to be a reason. So what else is going on with this person? Why did it really matter? So I started looking into her life story, and I started going all the way back, and I discovered some amazing things. I discovered that her grandfather signed the Declaration of Independence. He was George Walton Sr. He was one of the 3 signers from Georgia. Then I discovered a few other things. I discovered that anybody ever heard of Fort Walton Beach, Florida? Anybody ever visited? Okay. Fort Walton, Octavia Walton LeVert, that was her father. Walton County in Florida, and Walton is named after her father. He was the territorial governor of West Florida before it became a state, chosen by Andrew Jackson to come down after he left. He kind of took over. And then whenever it became a state and West Florida and East Florida united, he became the first secretary for the state of Florida. And so she and her family packed up from Augusta, Georgia, where she was born, and they moved to Pensacola, Florida. That's where she grew up. She was exposed to different languages. They realized that she was highly, highly intelligent, and she was very pretty. And very young, like 16, she started getting marriage proposals. She started getting courted. But think about it. She's the granddaughter of a signer. She never met him. He died before she was born. But her grandmother, his wife, she was very close to. And she's actually buried in Pensacola. So you can actually go see the wife of a signer in Pensacola, Florida today. They're great, within driving distance, very, very easily. She's buried in Pensacola. She told them stories, her and her brother Robert, about the Civil War, not the Civil War, I'm sorry, about the Revolutionary War, get my words mixed up, War of 1812. She told all these stories. And so she was felt very close to the Revolutionary story, very close to the country story, very connected, and pedigree you wouldn't believe. I mean, they were connected with everybody. Henry Clay was a close family friend. So whenever you start to get into somebody of that caliber and a family of that caliber, it changes everything. Even her painting, and this is the cover of my book, and it's such a woman. And the painting, this painting is at Oakley. It's the huge painting in the foyer on the second floor. And, excuse me, it is painted by Thomas Sully. Why is Thomas Sully? Why does that name sound vaguely familiar? Well, he painted the Andrew Jackson painting a lot of us think of when we think of Andrew Jackson. He also painted Thomas Jefferson. He was known for painting founding fathers and early colonial distinguished people. And she was one of them. And this painting is here in Mobile, Alabama. You can go visit it and hear more of her story connected to Oakley and how it got there. And that's actually in the book as well. So she had all of the right connections. She had the right pedigree. So if any gentleman at that time was wanting to move up in the world, you marry a person like Octavia Walton LeVert with her, or Octavia Walton, I'm sorry, she wasn't a LeVert yet, that has the right connections. But there was something really different about Octavia from a lot of these other young girls, especially in Pensacola, Florida. Because of her prestige, she had the freedom of choice. Normally, rural Pensacola, families trying to marry her off real quick, get her connected, get her out from underneath, you know, to grow and to get this family connection and help early America get it going. Well, they were not in such a hurry, to the point that Octavia did not marry until she was 26 years old. Now, in 1836, that's, you know, not a pretty late time to get married, but she had the freedom of choice and she was highly intelligent. I mean, noticeably so. I mean, it's written in family documents and papers how they're noticing how smart she is. And she's got a brother, Robert, who's just a few years younger than her. And they don't say that about Robert, but they were educated at the same time. So she's being educated with Robert. And I even want to say her mother and her grandmother, who were doing a lot of the educating because her father was involved with politics. So he wasn't around much. He was instrumental in establishing Tallahassee. He actually was one of the original people who went to and planted the first buildings in Tallahassee, Florida. So he was all involved with that. So he wasn't in Pensacola that much, which kind of wasn't a bad thing. He wasn't the best person in the world. And that's also another story. I mean, the man stole money from the state of Florida when it became a state. And then he got into a duel at Santa Rosa Island. So he's an interesting character. But so she grew up in just a different world, but had the freedom of choice. I think she really was able to do a lot of things, and she had a lot of opportunities that young women have back that didn't, like a lot of young women did not have back then. So for example, I think she got to make and choose the husband of her own. She got to choose her husband, Dr. Henry S. LeVert, in 1836. So when she met him and married him, I think they knew each other beforehand. Octavia was a storyteller. She always was. And there's journals and letters to show this. And so she likes to give this fanciful story of how they were both volunteering at a hospital and they fell in love and got married immediately. But I think they kind of knew each other beforehand. And Dr. LeVert was very different from the people she had been exposed to in her life. Normally, she had been exposed to politicians and to people who were high up. I mean, there's even rumors that a president was courting her. I mean, she had all of these people that she knew well. She traveled outside of Pensacola. She lived there, but back then they traveled a lot using trains and rails and using rivers and everything. They went all over. And as rail established in water, and there was a lot of traveling going on for that time, and you would be surprised at how much there was. But in 1836, she married Dr. Henry S. LeVert. And so she decides to settle down. Now, she was very popular beforehand. And when she married Dr. LeVert, she married a man that was very rock solid. He was quiet, low key, wasn't into politics really, wasn't into anything spectacular, but he was a solid guy. He was a very competent doctor. He actually, all right, before he came along and did some of his research, they did not know how to connect veins. If a vein got cut, there was trouble coming up with the material to connect veins together in the body so that the person wouldn't bleed or something like that to that extent. I'm not a doctor, so be forewarned. But he wrote a dissertation on how to use metal ligatures to connect veins together. And so that research was instrumental in developing other methods of research. So he's a very intelligent man, highly, highly intelligent. And so she decided to settle down with Dr. LeVert here in Mobile. They stayed at various long stay hotels in town. They did travel outside of the area. She had children. In 1849, by 1849, there was her and Dr. LeVert in the house. They had their oldest daughter, Diddy, who actually they named Octavia after Octavia, but to save confusion, that was their nickname for her. They had Sally, they had Claudia, they had the youngest, Henrietta. So up until that point, her life was pretty rosy. She had a lot of opportunity. She had a library when in a time then having a collection of books was difficult and expensive. She had multiple books. She talked about studying books and researching books. She would take text and she would translate it from English to Spanish to French and then back to the English as a pastime. And there's proof of this in her journals. And she did this when she was pregnant, because I checked the dates and I lined them up when she's suspecting her children. So she's bored and she's sitting still in the house and's got nothing to do. So this is like things she would do just off to the side. So she's a highly intelligent woman. Did not let her mind go to waste. Every time that she was stationary or had to be somewhere, she would learn something. She would teach herself something, or she would talk to politicians. Henry Clay was one. Henry Clay would come through the area. He came through numerous times and would visit her and her family. She was just a very, very, very sharp, intelligent, and they all knew it and they were fully aware of it. And they enjoyed her company. She was very vivacious, had a great personality. She was like the right mix of person to just be everywhere. So her life is pretty rosy. She has a dream to write herself, actually. At this time period, a lot of women would not name their books after themselves, like I have done with mine. Back then, they would come up with other names, which even the Bronte sisters, if you've read or learned anything about them, they did not first publish their books under their own names. They were under male names. This was the norm. It was, especially if you were a wealthy lady or of a well-established family, it was kind of improper. Like, for example, Octavia wrote a speech one time and she couldn't read the speech before the crowd that she wrote. A gentleman had to read the speech that she wrote for her. That's how the world was at that time, and the understanding of things in society was. But she had this dream that she was going to write. She wanted to write. She practiced writing. She was fond of it. She read everything she could get her hands on. She was connected to all the right people. And one of the right people that she met was Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. She started correspondence with him. She even asked him to be sort of a mentor so that she could develop this writing muscle. She needed encouragement like anybody else would. And so that's even whenever she wrote him and she said, can you be a mentor for me? Can you, provide me some guidance? And when you write me, please address me as Madame LeVert. So that's when she starts using the name Madame LeVert when she's writing. So that's the beginning of this transition to something, to other ideas and developing and saying, okay, my children are getting old enough. I'm starting to get where I'm comfortable in my skin. I'm going to start looking at this writing thing. Well, like life happens. Sometimes things happen that we don't expect. Sometimes life just doesn't go the way we plan. And Octavia, who for years had minimal tragedy, a lot of her family stepped in and took care of things for her. She had kind of an easy life to a degree. I mean, we all have struggles, but it really started hitting in March of 1849. Octavia's brother, Robert, suddenly died of what they called a brain fever. Unexpected, tragic. He was a lawyer practicing in Mobile with his father. He's preparing to take over his father's practice. Just devastated the family. And then, as if things could not get worse, in May of 1849, just 1 month later, Sally and Claudia, her two daughters, the two middle daughters, died of scarlet fever within a week of each other. I'll read you the letter she actually wrote Longfellow. This was May 23rd of 1849. Oh, my dear friend, pity me and pray for me, for I am indeed bereft. In 5 days, I have buried my two beautiful children. They died in my arms, both victims of scarlet fever. I have no words to shadow forth the deep, utteral agony of my soul. I feel I shall soon follow them. Will you not embalm my children's memory in some lines from your gifted pen? They would be most grateful to me. Sally died May 3rd. Claudia hung near her dying sister until her pure spirit left its earth tenement, then followed her to the grave on May 5th. Claudia's sickness and died 8th of May. She called for her sister as she died. Sally, Sally, oh, my kindred friend, no richness has ever so great as mine. I admired my children. They were so perfect, so loving, so beautiful. I cannot be comforted. She did go into a deep depression. She did have struggle. Dr. LeVert was worried about her deeply. But sometimes great tragedy can result in life-changing moments when dreams and directions shift. She mourned for her children. She closed up her salon. It was a place where people would meet and discuss thought and discuss politics and discuss life and discuss poetry and all kinds of interesting new concepts. She closed it up. She had this big palatial house at this point, downtown Mobile. Closed it up. Did not see anybody, did not welcome anybody. Locked the doors, turned off the lights. She used to have parties till 11 o'clock at night when the house would be full of lights by candlesticks. All shut down. But Longfellow, after a couple of years, he said, you know what? I might need to send some people to visit her. You got to remember, he's in New York. He's up north way. And so there was a person that Octavia admired in all of her reading and all of her literature, and her name was Frederica Bremer. And in 1851, with a letter of invitation, which you got to remember, this is Longfellow, right? So if he sends somebody to visit you with a letter of invitation, you do not say no. You do not tell them go away. You welcome them. And so he did. She did. After all that time, she welcomed Frederica Bremer. Now, who was Frederica Bremer? And people, this is another forgotten lady. She was a lady from Sweden, and her works were known all over the world and had been translated into endless number of languages. She was as popular as Charles Dickens. Today, we don't hardly hear of her. You can get her books for free on online. You can buy her books. They're available. They're out in the public domain. And she was a lady who was single, and she traveled the world. And she wrote about her journey, and people loved her stories. And so she came to see Octavia Walton LeVert. So while she's visiting Octavia, she's going through all of her letters and her writings, and Octavia and her are talking. And she says, you know what? You need to get out of this. And the best thing to get out of this is to start writing. Start channeling your sadness and your feelings and those emotions. Instead of sitting here in your house and quiet and all of this, let's make a change. Let's do something different. So Octavia and Jenny Lind, I'm sorry, Frederica Bremer, Jenny Lind's another person. They get together and they take a boat to New Orleans, and they see the city and they see the sights, and they go to find something to write about, and they visit a number of landmarks in New Orleans. But here's the thing. They also loved opera. They also loved the theater. Actually, Octavia was very instrumental in local theater here in Mobile at the time, and no different in New Orleans. So they tried to find a place in New Orleans for Octavia to cut her teeth on, something that would be published in the newspapers, that would go out everywhere, just to get her used to the idea of getting her material out into the world instead of just holding it close at home and in letters and among friends and family. She needed to get it published in the newspapers. So they went and saw Jenny Lind. Jenny Lind was an internationally known Swedish songstress, and everybody knew her work. Everybody listened to her and loved her music. This is back then, whenever they didn't have iPhone to play music. You had to go places, and you wouldn't just, you get good reviews, and if a person's got a great review, then you go and pay the money to go see them. So she was receiving great reviews, and everybody loved her music and her singing. And Octavia wrote an article all about her singing. So with the help of Frederica Bremer, it got picked up by the New Orleans newspaper, and then it got picked up by the Mobile Press Register, and it got picked up, and eventually it ended up in newspapers all throughout the country. And the subtext was Madame LeVert. So she is now published, whereas before she was not. So Jenny Lind, I'm stuck on that one. Frederica Bremer, who was a woman who traveled the world and would write about her travels, must have planted the idea in Octavia's brain to travel to Europe. And so 1 year later, Octavia makes plans, gets some of her family together, and they go to Europe for the first time. And she writes about it, and she sends articles and stories back to her mother, who's still living here in Mobile. And those things get published in the local newspaper. And then she meets Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, and that really got published in the newspapers all throughout the country. So people are now learning her stories and reading her stories all throughout the United States and other places. Hawaii even Hawaii in its beginning was receiving the connections and receiving the stories. So there are now all throughout the world. So she became so popular. She was already popular, mind you, but she became even more popular from her journey to Europe the first go around, that she went again a year later, wrote more stories, has a journal. One of the journals is at Oakley, and you can easily go and see it if you request it. They're in the process of digitizing it right now. Another journal is at the State Archives, and that one doesn't have so much of her journey, but it has some other really good material. But you can do that. Well, then 6 years later, it becomes published. So she has her first book published, her only book published. The Civil War stopped the rest of them that she was wanting to do. But she has her first and only book officially published, and it was called Souvenirs of Travel. And you can read it today. You can go on to the internet, Google Souvenirs of Travel by Madame Octavia Walton LeVert, and you can read it yourself today. I will warn you, it's written like 1857. So it's kind of like, what is it? Jane Austen goes on a grand tour. So if you like Jane Austen, then you're good. You're going to be able to read it without much issues. But if you don't, then I do summarize it in my book. So it's there's a little bit, pretty good explanation of everything that she goes and where she travels in the journals. And she writes about her experiences. But her observations are amazing. I mean, she articulates everything. She talks about meeting, all kinds of people. Dukes, princes, Stephen Douglas, who was a congressman, and he was running against Abraham Lincoln, was also a good connection and friend of theirs. And so he gave letters of introduction for her. So while she was traveling through Europe, she could visit all of these amazing places where she normally wouldn't visit. She met Pope Pius, and she saw everything. Her journal is really quite interesting. So that is how a sad moment can be kind of channeled into something better with the influence of friends and family and people supporting. Now, that's just one of the stories pertaining to Octavia. It's by far not the last. For her, it's astounding how one person could do so much in a lifetime, where one thing would be like the significant thing like any regular person would have. She was instrumental in so many things. She was the first Alabama representative for the Mount Vernon Ladies Association to help save George Washington's home. She was also one of the biggest fundraisers for that effort. And she was connected. She knew so many people. I'm still discovering stuff today. I wrote this a year ago. I finished it a year ago. It took me 5 years to write. I tracked everything down. There were so many rumors and stories about her, but I tracked every bit of that down. There's one about her meeting Lafayette when he was traveling through Alabama, and that story too. Is it true? Is it not true? Well, see, Octavia was a pretty good storyteller, and it could be true, but I will tell you, she's the one who originated that story. So you'll kind of have to take it as it is. I'm going to say it did happen. It may not have happened exactly like her memory, but I can say that I'm pretty sure it did happen. But that's just one of the stories. If you want to learn more about Octavia Walton LeVert, there are plenty of places that'll pop up when you Google her. But you can certainly get my book. The website is suchawomanbook.com, just like the title, Such a Woman. The reason why I called it Such a Woman is that Washington Irving, and I don't know if you know who he is, but Washington Irving wrote Rumpelstiltskin and those stories that we know today. He said that such a woman exists but once in an empire. So, sometimes a book names itself. And in that case, I think it did. So Such a Woman, The Life of Madame Octavia Walton LeVert. Now, that is my nonfiction book. I have two, Mobile Under Siege and Octavia. Such a Woman. But I did venture into, I'll just share this real quick. I wrote my first fiction book, and it's Mississippi Mojo and Murder. And it's Mississippi Mojo book.com, but you can also access it on Such a Woman. And it's doing really well. It's got picked up by the Mississippi Book Festival. So I will be there with that book. And we just finished the second book. It's going to be a 3-book series. We just finished the second one on that. But in any case, thank y'all for having me. And I am open to questions and comments and anything you like.
Yeah, thank you very much for coming on here. Anybody, if you have any questions, please unmute and ask away.
I'm not that thorough.
I'd like to know more about the about how she got involved with Mount Vernon. I thought that was fascinating. That do you know? Was there one particular friend that she knew that?
Yeah.
Was that
Edward Everett? He's another person that you will probably never heard of. Edward Everett wrote a dedication to George Washington. This dedication, this is pre-Civil War, 1850s. This dedication became so famous that he was invited to do this talk about George Washington all over the United States. And he started doing this as a fundraiser. He fell in love with what the Mount Vernon's Ladies, it wasn't the Mount Vernon's Ladies Association. I can't remember the name right off of the lady who started it. She got a letter, but the story's in the book. She got a letter from her mother who visited George Washington's home. And the letter said how terrible of a condition his house is in, and how sad the house is in such bad shape for it to be George Washington. So the lady who received her mother wrote the letter to, she said, oh, this is a bad thing. We need to really unite and try to save this home of George Washington. Well, she tried to get people in the government to help. Congress, she petitioned to people. Nobody was interested. So she said, well, sometimes ladies just have to get together and do what they need to do. So that's what she did. She united with a number of ladies, and the numbers increased. But then Edward Everett, and there's one book about him that's really interesting. So if anybody wants, just go to Amazon and type in Edward Everett, and you'll get his full story. He was involved with Congress. He was Secretary of State after Daniel Webster for a short period of time. He realized that he was a better orator than he was a congressman or a person who was secretary. He didn't like it. So he transitioned out of that pretty quick. And he started promoting and doing these fundraising events to help save Mount Vernon with this group of ladies. And so he and Octavia had known each other for years. And so he invited her to participate. And she did such a good job at fundraising that she was immediately assigned that position as the first representative from Alabama, which still exists today. I met her about a year ago, the lady who's now the Alabama representative at the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. Sweet lady. Yeah. She didn't want me to share anything about her though. She's kind of quiet and low key.
That is so interesting. I back in that day to be, so aware and interested. I just think that's wonderful that she did that.
Mm-hmm. It's a marvelous story. Just the ladies and their forming of that group.
Oh yeah, that was so lucky. The ladies took charge.
They did. Sometimes you have to.
Right.
Does anybody else have any questions?
Oh, come on. I'm a librarian. I get them a lot. I'm okay. How about questions about anything? I mean, about research. I mean, I do that all the time.
Yeah. So how did you go about, finding all this information about her.
Okay. I started simple. I have a method. I'm a contemporary researcher, so you got technology and internet and all that stuff today, and it's very helpful, and it gives you access to more materials than you used to in the past. So any biographies, it even gets to the point where some of the biographies that were written like from the 1980s and back, it makes me wonder what they're lacking because they don't have technology to speed things up a little bit today and help with that research process. I started going online and getting everything I could about her online, getting dates, getting rumors, getting everything. She's a very rumored person. There's negative rumors, there's positive rumors, there's all kinds of stories associated with her that are verge on myth. And so I wanted to see if they were true or not. It's easy enough to write a story about a myth, but you want to really get the facts. So I tracked everything on the internet down. And then I started going to original source material, like digital files, diving into archives specifically in collections, and then looking for people who knew her. So Henry Clay, she's mentioned in Henry Clay's papers. Henry Clay's papers are online. So I went through Henry Clay's papers and found the mentions of her, but they don't necessarily have her as a search term. So I had to go through and read a lot of his material. And then same thing with Mount Vernon. Mount Vernon has a really good archive. If you want to read about the papers where Everett, and Octavia have conversations back and forth, they're at the Mount Vernon Digital Archive. And so I went there and dived into the material that they had there. There was here's one of the most interesting things. There is a autographed journal of her as a young girl, starting about 15 years old until she's in her 20s, before she marries Dr. LeVert. And it's all of these famous autographs. They write poems. Back then, an autograph journal, if you admired somebody or you were courting somebody, you would write a poem in the ladies' journal. And it could be a poem that you made up, that you read somewhere, that you modified for this particular person. Like a girl, you like a girl and her hair is gold and not brown, and the poem says the hair is brown. You're going to change it to gold, right? Because you're interested in this young lady, or her eyes are blue, things like that. So there's a journal, and this is what's amazing, is that this journal is at Columbia, and it's in the Poe collection, as in Edgar Allan Poe. And I was like, why is it in the Edgar Allan Poe collection? So it turns out that when she was a young lady and she was being first introduced to society, because that's what they did back then, they were courting her and showing her off to everybody and saying, hey, I got this eligible young lady right here in my family, and are y'all, just the way things work. So they had her in Philadelphia at the same time as Edgar Allan Poe, and she was being introduced to society, and it's either his first poem or his second poem is dedicated to her. And we all know it today as To Octavia, and that is Octavia Walton LeVert.
That is amazing. I've been a big Edgar Allan Poe fan for years, and I have a whole book of his collections. And I've actually
now you're
read
gonna
that
go look up To Octavia.
As soon as I'm done here, I'm gonna go in there and I'm looking at it. That's amazing.
It's either his first or his second. There were two young ladies he visited. It's when he quit military service or he quit school, and he was in a transition period and he was going someplace else. He jumped around a lot. He wasn't as bad as they say he was. There's a lot of rumors. He wasn't nearly that bad, but he was a bit flighty. But, you're a rich, wealthy young man who's got money to burn and people to visit and places to go, and your creative soul, not surprised. So, but yeah, To Octavia is to actually Octavia Walton LeVert.
Wow. Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned that, you set out to try to figure out, separate the myth from the facts. Were there any, myths that, you found that was, you were just really able to just debunk or anything, or?
Oh, yeah. Okay. One of the myths was that again, we live, I don't know if you're here or not, but if you don't, Mobile is old, and there's old stories everywhere. So there is a rumor, even Pensacola's another old city, that whenever her father was in a duel, he on Santa Rosa Island or somewhere close, because they never divulged the location. So he has stolen money. He stole $10,000 from the state of Florida. That's a lot of money today. Can you imagine what it was back in the 1830s? I have to look up the dates to get it right. That's why I write a book, because I can't remember all these dates. But he was in a duel, and he got injured in this duel. Well, they tried to hide it. And the rumor was that her and her mother nursed him back to health. And the journal that has the Poe poem in it proves with dates that they were nowhere near the family and nowhere near Pensacola. Mama took daughter and got out of town when Daddy got into a duel. She wasn't about to expose her daughter, who is probably the redeeming factor for this family, because I mean, the father was really running the family into ruin. But back then, you had to have a male figure in your household, because women could not do a whole lot if they didn't have this male figure leading the household back then. So you had to keep him. you didn't want to keep him, but you had to keep him. And so, but they could have some freedom. So what Mama did is took daughter, and I think they used her brother Robert as kind of their escort, and they left town. So she didn't nurse anybody back to health. He was on his own with his mess in Pensacola. She was in Natchez at the time. Little things like that matter.
She must have said, "You got yourself into this mess, you can get yourself out of it."
That is exactly right. Yep. Mama was smart. And you can see pictures of these people. That's the other thing that's really amazing, is that George Walton Jr., Sally, the family, Octavia, her husband, their photographs are at Oakley. Their paintings, photographs, look at me. I'm so contemporary. Their paintings are at Oakley. So you can actually go and see them. Whenever you visit Oakley, they're all in the second floor. The big painting of Octavia is the significant one, because it's a Thomas Sully. It's amazing. And then the others, the one by Dr. LeVert is a sergeant, which is still amazing if you look up these artists. But the others are right there, and you can see exactly what they look like. So you get an idea of who these people are. Octavia had a lot of paintings of her too. They're in the book. I do have colors of them. The publisher it's very expensive to get a book published with color these days. Very expensive, to the point that they almost have to send it out of country to get it done. So it's very cost prohibitive. So it's black and white, but if you're interested in any of that, I can see about it. You can certainly go to Oakley and do a tour, and they will tell you all about the family. I've actually also, like, they had rumors and stories with the painting that they had been telling for years, and I actually read like the little script that the docents do when they give you tours. They've since adjusted that from the research. So they've updated that to what actually happened, or modified it. Because the last research done on this was back in the 1980s. And I like mine better.
Yeah.
Oh.
Well, that's really cool. Any other questions before we go for tonight?
I have one. Is the LeVert home still intact, or is it still in Mobile? I mean, do you know?
The LeVert home is no longer together.
That's
okay.
So.
Yeah, that's another issue. The house was very famous, and Mobile was a Confederate city. Now there were one third people here in the city were Unionists. I know a lot of people think that the entire South was all supportive of the Confederate, but they were not. A third of the city were still Unionists. Yeah, I remember we had a lot of international people here. We had, Mobile had the highest population of former enslaved, freed people here. And they stayed here during this time period because people couldn't just leave. I mean, you couldn't just get a ticket and fly out. You know, you when you were placed and you were here, you were stuck here in a lot of ways, financially, everything. So the population was about a third. And so whenever she let the Union troops in her house, it did not garner goodwill. The rest of the houses in the city, the bigger ones, were taken over by Union troops unwillingly. And so hers was offered. She knew them. She had known them their entire life. The Union commanders that had come in, they were very close friends. They had spent time together. So she was like welcoming home friends. So as time moved on, she left and the house was pretty much abandoned. The Union's troops used it as an outpost. The first judge after the Union North and South was reunified, the first judge in the Southern District was housed in that house. So you've got animosity associated with the house. Over time, there was lack of care. It was passed from one people to another group. And in the 1960s, despite many efforts to save the house, they tore the house down because the Bankhead Tunnel had been built adjacent. And I am a good friend with the last remaining person alive who lived in the house. Her name is Paula, which is interesting. So she said that the Bankhead Tunnel had shattered, just rattled the house to pieces. And it was already kind of run down, not cared. And so over time that there was really nothing they could do to save the home. So the city, they could take architectural salvage, anything they wanted to from the home, and they did. But they were able to save Dr. LeVert's office. His office was right next to the house, and it still stands today. The courthouse is actually built around his office.
Right.
And so you can go there today and see his office, and her name is on plaques all around that office. Her name is on plaques all over the city.
Yeah.
People just don't know it until you walk around, you start reading, you see Madame LeVert everywhere. And then you realize, oh, wait a minute, who is this person? Why is she so significant? And then you finally start to figure it out. Mm-hmm. So, but there are a few things associated with the house, though. For example, the windows and pieces of the house do still exist today. They were taken to the Eastern Shore and added into the construction of Paula's house. So her family owned property on the Eastern Shore, bought property before it was popular. And so they've done very well. And they have integrated into her home what remains of those windows and pieces. And you see pieces of the house all through her home. And then there was a pile of bricks from the house when they tore it down. And people building a house in the 1960s drove by and bought the bricks and took it and used it as part of their home. So it still lives on, but in pieces. And then somebody just told me yesterday that the front doors is here in Sims. I don't know where, but I'm going to find out.
All right. Well, I just want to thank you again for coming on here and speaking to us all. Just one last time, can you remind everybody where we can find your books?
Oh, yeah. Suchawomanbook.com is the website. It'll link you to other interviews that I've done. If you'll send me a link to this one, I will add it to my website. And it's available. Also, Mississippi Mojo and Murder is there as well. And Mobile Under Siege links are all on this website. And that's suchawomanbook.com. We have a sequel to Mississippi Mojo and Murder coming out. It's called Devilry in the Delta. And it will be out in a couple of months. The draft is at the beta readers now. So
It's very exciting.
It's been busy.
Your book was excellent. I enjoyed it thoroughly. So
thank you so much. Wish I could sign it for you. So maybe.
All right. Well, thank you again. And thank you to everybody that came on tonight and watched. You all have a wonderful evening.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.